Hey everybody, good morning and good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. We're definitely excited to have you on board for another one of our virtual user groups. Before we actually get started here, I just want to do a couple technical checks just to make sure everybody can see my screen and hear me. So if you could raise your hand just as an indicator that there are no issues. So yeah, we got a couple hands up. Good stuff. All right, cool. So yeah, we're gonna get going here. Um, Again, we're definitely excited to have all you with us today. We're also excited to have Millennium Pharmaceuticals with us to share their cool story of how they implemented both a compliant and specialized ServiceNow platform under FDA regulations. So definitely a unique challenge to say the least. So a lot of you have attended one of our bugs in the past, and you probably know a little bit about us already. But before jumping in, just want to give you a reminder of who we are, just a little background. So up on screen, you'll just see a couple numbers that we take great pride in. 200 plus cloud experts, 10 plus years of ITIL and service management experience, and then actually over 325 implementations. So I actually say that last number for last, just because that is the most implementations done by any ServiceNow partner. So again, that's definitely something we're proud of. But it's worth mentioning that we're more than just a implementation partner. We offer a full range of products, services, and technologies to help you during any stage of the service management lifecycle. And all these business lines that you see up on the screen are focused exclusively on the ServiceNow platform, and that's actually garnered us the exclusive status of being a preferred services partner of ServiceNow. So, a little introduction to our speakers today. Again, very happy to have Millennium with us, being represented by John Chun, who is their Director of IT Operations. John's actually going to be driving a majority of the presentation today, but we also have Dan and Chris from Fruition, who work very closely with we're all in the Millennium Project. So we have them on hand just to give you a little more technical insight into the project. So last screen here before we get going. Again, this is a user group. We emphasize that, so please be active, engage. We don't save questions and answers for the end. So anytime you have a question, go ahead and enter it in that question box. I'll be keeping a close eye on that. So as soon as we can, we'll get to that question and answer it. The other piece we have in play here are the polls. I think we have about 3 of those for today. So be on the lookout for that little icon in the bottom right corner. That'll just be an indicator that that specific page or slide will be releasing or opening up a poll for you to participate in. So without any further delay, I'm going to go ahead and pass the presentation on to John. So one second here, John. Let me know if you're set, John. Just pass the presentation off to you.
Okay, I just picked that up and then I'm sharing my PowerPoint. Can everyone see my slide here?
Awesome. Yeah, I can see it, John.
Good. All right, hello everyone. My name is John Chun. I'm Director of IT Operations at Millennium Pharmaceuticals in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I also have Cheryl Boudet here with me today. She's our Manager of IT Operations, and she was the PM for Project Manager for ServiceNow deployment. We transitioned from Remedy 7.5 and went live with the ServiceNow on April 1st. and we've been very happy with it so far. And I want to introduce a little bit about Millennium Pharmaceuticals. Millennium Pharmaceuticals is an oncology-focused pharma company here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we are actually a wholly owned subsidiary of a number one Japanese pharma company called Takeda. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with Takeda, but they're not really a household brand in the U.S., but they actually had just expanded to European market as well as the rest of global market by acquiring another European company called Nycomed about 2 years ago. And Millennium itself is just focused on developing and marketing cancer drugs. And our flagship product is called Velcade, and it's for multiple myeloma. And we currently have actually quite a few drugs candidates in the pipeline. So today's agenda is going to cover what is validation and what happens during validation, and what problem are we trying to solve here, and then can we reduce documentation time by, say, about a factor of 1,000? And that, I think, is a pretty ambitious goal, but that's something that we accomplished here. So I'm going to walk you through the steps of how we actually got to that. And then we'll be giving out some technical tidbits so you can actually do some of these on your own, possibly with the help from Fruition. And then I'll give you top 3 takeaways from today's presentation. And then again, as Mike said, we're going to have questions coming in throughout the whole presentation, so please do feel free to ask questions at any time. So at this point, I'd like to conduct a poll. Mike, do you have that question ready?
I do. Thanks, John, for setting that up. So yeah, we're going to start off with just a kind of quick basic poll here and just ask, and I'm going to launch right now. So if you can't see it, I'll read it out loud. So the first question or poll question is, do you work in an FDA regulated company? So the options are yes, no, I don't know. So hopefully nobody votes I don't know, but we'll see. So we'll give everybody probably about 20 seconds to go ahead and vote, and then once the votes stop coming in, we'll close it up and share the results with everybody. So we'll probably give it about 10 more seconds here. All right. So we're going to go ahead and close it. It looks like we had 80% of you vote. So thank you for participating. So here are the results, which actually is pretty surprising. I'm surprised there's that many yeses. So again, the poll question is, do you work in an FDA regulated company? 40% said yes, and 60% said no. So I'm going to go ahead and close that and pass it back to you, John. But at the end of the webinar, I can actually go ahead in a follow up and share these results with everybody as well, just so you have it on hand. So hide the results, and John, you're back up.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Hey, that's good to know. Thank you, Mike. And the reason why I asked that question was that at Millennium Pharmaceuticals, being an FDA-regulated company here, we had to follow through some very strict protocol in what's called the validation process. And I'm going to walk you through some of the things that we have done here, but understanding that who works in that FDA-regulated companies is going to be helpful for me to just to make sure that you all understand what we're talking about. And one more thing is that what I'm presenting today is applicable to anyone who is outside of FDA-regulated companies as well. So you're going to have takeaways at the end of the presentation that will help you to make your documentation process better and possibly your the deployment process better as well. So please bear with me as I go through here. And as I come across any FDA-specific lingo, I'm going to explain to you what that is. And one thing that I also want to tell you at this point is when I talk about QA, QA stands for quality assurance, And in many of the industries, QA means software testing. Within the FDA space, QA means ensuring that our processes do comply with the FDA regulations. So when I say QA, that means some specific department within my company where they oversee our processes and documentation just to make sure that they are conforming to FDA regulations. And they do not necessarily are software testing departments. So having said that, I just want to give you a definition of what is a validation. So within the FDA space, we do define a validation as this here, and the key phrase here is documented evidence. So establishing documented evidence which provides a high degree of assurance that a specific computer system will consistently produce a result meeting its predetermined specifications and quality attributes. This was originally written around drug manufacturing, but I kind of rephrased this a little bit to be applicable to in our case where we're more concerned with the computer systems than manufacturing machines. So I rephrased that a little bit. But the key phrase here again is we have to produce documented evidence that everything that we are producing when we deploy ServiceNow is going to meet that specific requirements that we set forth in the beginning. So moving through that, what happens during validation? We do a lot of documentation, and then more documentation, and more documentation. And then we also have to go through lots of revisions and more revisions. And this is very labor intensive and very time consuming, error prone, as you can imagine. And it's very hard to track changes with accuracy. And as you can imagine, as we go through the deployment process, the requirements that we gather in the beginning are not static, meaning that they're going to change over time. And with this kind of very rigid documentation process, it's very hard to track those changes as things become very dynamic. And in the next slide here, I just want to show you graphically how the whole process flows. GAMP, GAMP is an industry organization, and they promote, excuse me, that's actually, GAMP actually stands for Good Automated Manufacturing Practice. It's a practice that's being promoted by an industry organization called the ISPE, and their primary interest is in drug manufacturing, but again, they have extended over the years their good practice into computer systems as well. So this diagram is showing you the overall process of going from user requirements, which starts at the top left, and then going down into functional requirements, and then turning into detailed designs, and then you configure a system such as ServiceNow, and then you conduct unit testing, functional testing, eventually leading up to user acceptance testing before you release the product to the end users. So over on the left side, as you come down, you go through the specification process, and then on the right side, as you go back up, you go through the verification process. So this diagram is called the V diagram for validation. Now, when you look at this, the process here, it's not really specific to pharma companies. It's not really specific to FDA-regulated industries. Rather, I'm sure all of you can relate to having to go through these steps in your everyday life as you're deploying any system, including ServiceNow. So here, what problem are we trying to solve? What were some of the pain points that we were trying to resolve here? And before I go through the steps, again, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Mike for him to conduct another poll here, please.
Thanks, John. So yeah, our next poll question, the question is, does your organization keep test cases and test scripts for all your live processes? So available options are yes, no, I don't know. So again, we'll give everybody a few seconds to go ahead and vote, and then we'll share the results. So we still have some votes coming in. Thanks to everybody for participating. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it up. and we'll share the results here. So again, the poll question was, does your organization keep test cases and test scripts for all your lab processes? So 67% said yes, 27% said no, and then 7% said I don't know. So go ahead and hide those and pass it back to you, John.
All right, thank you very much again. And let me just switch back to here. Okay. Everybody can see my slide here? Okay, I'll take that as a yes.
Yep. Yeah, we can.
Okay, and so some of the challenges that we ran into was that we were collecting requirements in Excel and Word, and some of you may also be doing that, but I felt that that was not an efficient way of collecting requirements. And then what we also had to do was we had to then transcribe those requirements into Word templates. Again, when it comes to producing these documents, we have to follow very specific guidelines and requirements dictated by what the FDA is expecting from us. And our QA department, again, the department that dictates, that oversees our processes, they have produced a certain set of document templates that we all follow. And then we have to maintain traceability across all these here, and I'll show you. As we go through those, the process diagram that I just showed you, we now have to maintain what's called a traceability, meaning that which user requirement is tied to which functional requirement, and then which functional requirement is tied to which detailed design specification, and then all the test cases and all the test scripts. So if you have a test script that failed, you must be able to trace that back all the way to the user requirement and be able to tell, say, to an FDA inspector that, hey, yes, so we had this test script failing on us, and then that actually tied all the way back to this particular very specific user requirement. So all that relationship is documented in what's called a traceability matrix document. And then whenever we add or remove any of the requirements or test scripts and whatnot, we have to revise the traceability matrix document in addition to any of the specific documents we're producing as part of our project. And when we asked our contractors, we actually had technical writers as part of the project, and when we asked actually two vendors about the effort that takes to produce such traceability metrics, they came back to us, both actually same numbers, 40 hours of work just to create traceability metrics. So on the next page, I want to show you a sample traceability matrix. And this is kind of a document that you have to update, maintain, and then again, it takes about 40 hours effort for producing this and make sure that there are no errors. And as you can imagine here, you know, missing a dot there is going to alter the meaning of that particular section of the document. So you can imagine the type of the scrutiny that you have to go through to make sure that this kind of a document is correct throughout the entire cycle of the project deployment. So at this point, I want to just give you just quick background information on why I came up with this idea of using additional tools to maintain our requirements and then eventually be able to generate this kind of a traceability metrics automatically. About 10 years ago, I used to work at a financial company in New York. And at that time, I transitioned from being a project manager for website development to IT operations. And my first task was to revamp change management. And at that time, we were using old Remedy system. I mean, that was a new Remedy at the time. And the Remedy web client was broken, so the engineers could not submit change tickets through Remedy. So what they were doing was they were just sending email in free text about the upcoming changes. And I said, well, that's not going to work. So I tried to fix that remedy at the time, but my manager declined to provide any money for hiring contractors. So having had some web development experience myself, I started actually putting together some web-based tools just for me to keep up with all the changes. Eventually, that tool became very popular. We decided to use that company-wide, and that became our requirement tracker, incident tracker, change management tool, as well as a release management tool. And we also tracked the testing, software testing records in there as well. And by that time, I was doing change management, release management, and software testing. So that kind of web tool gave us a very good way of tracking everything, making sure everything tied to one another, and be able to produce reports and whatnot almost instantaneously. So when I came to this point at Millennium Pharmaceuticals, I did ask others, hey, what kind of other tools are you using? And when I realized that they were not using any tools, I said, oh, wait a minute, we cannot go on like this. And that's just going to be a recipe for failure for the project. So that actually was a bit of a background knowledge that I had that prompted me to go and explore better ways of producing this type of traceability metrics and the overall project documentation. So moving on to the next slide here. I'm just going to walk you through how we solve the problem. Again, I did leverage some of the background knowledge experience that I had from back in the old days of a financial company. But as soon as I saw Fruition's Requirements Center, this actually came with our instance of ServiceNow. When we engaged the Fruition, one thing that they also introduced besides their professional services was that they installed the Fruition Requirements Center in our instance of ServiceNow. That only came with what we would consider functional requirements and bug tracking modules. So what we did was we added additional modules for user requirement specifications, detailed design specifications, test cases, test scripts, and test runs. And then we linked all these using what's called the reference fields and related lists in ServiceNow. What that means is that traceability across all those different records are maintained automatically. And again, based on some of the background that I had, I was able to just put this together in about 1 hour of time within ServiceNow, based on what Fruition had already provided, plus the additional modules, and then just relating all those together. So that took only about an hour. And then we were able to generate traceability metrics in about 2 minutes of time. So that's 40 hours of work. Again, that was an estimation from our 2 vendors. Got reduced down to 2 minutes. Now, that's more than a factor of 1,000. So that's the number that I actually gave out in the beginning. But we were actually be able to see that in our own experience. And at this point, I'd like to turn microphone over to Chris Damon, who was our engagement manager, and then he can explain to you about a little bit more about Fruition Requirements Center. Chris? Hello?
Well, hopefully he's there, John.
Okay.
He might just be able to
If
hear
not,
us. If
if
not,
not,
we can move forward, or maybe have Dan jump in and explain a little bit
yes.
about the Requirement Center if he's available. Either you there, Chris or Dan?
Yeah, can you hear me? This is Dan.
Yep, we can hear you, Dan. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and Chris, if you're muted, you can jump on anytime too. So yeah,
hey,
if you want to move to,
I'm here. Sorry about that.
Okay. Chris,
I
do you want to
thanks, Jeff.
the overview? Sure, no problem.
Sure. So one of the things that myself and a lot of us at Fruition have experienced, what we've experienced over the years with all the implementations we've done, is that the quality of requirements that you get can range anywhere from someone took a picture of a whiteboard with their big vision to tomes of requirements that take up a whole multiple 3-ring binders and a team of BAs to parse through it all to to figure out what it is, how we really want to design the system. So knowing that there's great variances across how we get requirements from the folks, the clients that we're engaging with, we developed this Fruition Requirement Center on ServiceNow. And what it allows us to do is have we still may have lots of requirements. We may still have very few requirements, but what it does allow us to do is allows us to put those requirements into the ServiceNow platform. So a couple of quick benefits on that. One, it's collaborative. So what we like to do with the Requirement Center is open it up for the team members participating, key stakeholders, those that are participating in the project to submit requirements into Requirement Center. So the collaborative nature is great. I mean, how many people on this call have been on a project where there's some Excel spreadsheet that just keeps bouncing from inbox to inbox to inbox, or it's on a Dropbox share and a SharePoint site and, on someone's desktop, and you never know which version is the authoritative source of those requirements. So we get away from that with Requirement Center. We also have added workflow to it. So we have states where it goes through a status of new. When somebody submitted it, it's just an idea, or it's the shell of a requirement, or something we want to consider to take on in the engagement. We will then review it as the Fruition team to look at it to see how complex is this, or what's the level of effort to define it, to make these requirements realized on the platform. We will then discuss it with the client, in this case, with John and his team at Millennium, and then they would approve it. So once it's approved, it goes into ready for development state, and that's where our team, or if we're partnering up with folks on the client side, we will develop the work. It will go through a series of unit tests. It will then go into formal QA, and hopefully the expected result is that through formal QA it gets approved and it gets flagged for ready for deployment, ready for rollout. And from a traceability perspective, we now have who entered it, who is interacting with the requirement, adding additional information, when it was approved, who approved it, who did the development work, and actually we capture update sets too. So if you're familiar with update sets in ServiceNow, what it allows us to do is say this requirement was built and was in this particular update set that we can then promote to the other instances. So that's one half of the Requirement Center. This is the entering of requirements. The other half of it is, and again, in the spirit of traceability, we also have the defect side of the Requirement Center application. And the defects, we can say, against this requirement, I'm opening this defect, it failed. Here was the expected result, and here was the actual result. We can assign those defects to folks doing the development work and the configuration work. They can then resolve it, of course, send it back through QA, and hopefully it gets resolved. And then at that point, we not only have when it was submitted, when it was approved, who built it, what updates that it was applied, and we also now know all the defects that were logged against that requirement. And then when that defect was introduced into which update set, so again, traceability to where this is stored and how it was promoted across the instances. So it allows us to have full traceability from entering through promotion, and it's had very, very positive results. It's taken us away from the old days of, like I said, bouncing around, Excel files through inboxes, and it's been, it's been extremely helpful in a lot of our engagements, and it certainly was helpful at Millennium. So
great, thank you so much,
Chris. Questions
Chris.
about that? Okay, back to you, John.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions to Chris? I'll show you a couple more slides here and show you how we actually worked with the Fruition Requirement Center plus some of the extended features that we implemented. And then again, if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask at any time. So here is a screenshot of what it looks like within ServiceNow. Again, if you look at on the left side here, the Fruition Requirement Center came installed with our instance. And then there are several modules there. And the second module, functional requirement, is what came with the Fruition Requirement Center. And at the bottom, the defect that also came with the Fruition Requirement Center. And then we added those other modules in there as we actually needed them to complete our release cycle and documentation. And if you look on this here, the application dropdown, was actually where we were keeping track of the different applications we were configuring within ServiceNow. So we deployed the incident, problem, change, and config. So we had those 4 applications listed in the dropdown. Plus, we had some like a general or system-wide requirements as well as like a FDA-specific requirements. So we were keeping track of all those by using that drop-down there. And then as Chris mentioned here, we were just working through the workflows through the state drop-down value over there. So in this particular case, it's showing dev pending, meaning that whoever is assigned to here now is working on configuring that particular requirement in the system. And that's showing that the assignee. I'm sorry. And then, so this is a screenshot of the requirements, the user requirements. And then on the next page, I'm going to show you how the reference fields were tied to the related lists. So at the top of the slide here, I'm showing you the user requirement, on the screen that you just saw on the previous slide. And then at the bottom of the user requirement form are the list of functional requirements that are related to that particular user requirement. So in this case, there was one user requirement that ended up with the 4 functional requirements. And at the bottom, I'm showing you a section of a functional requirement, a top section of the functional requirement form, where it is showing the reference field. So that red box over there that I'm showing you is actually how this particular functional requirement is tied to the URS, the user requirement specification. So in this case, that URS number is specified there. That means this particular functional requirement is related to that particular user requirement. And then using the related list in the URS, now you are able to tie the 2 together. And so this is how we establish the relationships and the traceability across user requirement and functional requirement. And we repeated the same thing across all the different modules that we were using. And moving on to just showing you all the modules that we configured here. So at the top left, we are showing user requirements, which had a one-to-many relationship with the functional requirements. And then functional requirements also had a one-to-many relationship with the test cases to the right. And then each test case may also spin off one or more test scripts. So there was one-to-many relationship. And then each test script may had one or more test runs. So again, that turned into one-to-many relationships. Each test run may create 0 or more defects. So there you can again see either 0 to many relationship. And again, those defects will eventually have traceability tying it all the way back to the functional requirements and then user requirements. And as for detailed design there at the bottom, I'm going to get to a little more detail around that in a couple more slides. But we decided to go with the many-to-one relationship for detailed design, and I'll actually show you why we chose to go that route. In terms of the coloring here, the green boxes were the modules provided by Fruition, and the purple boxes were the ones that we custom designed on our own. And at this point, Mike, there's another poll question, please.
Yes, there is, and this is actually our last poll question for the day. So actually, this poll question might tie back to an earlier slide a little better, but it's still relevant to the overall discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and launch it and read it out loud for everybody. So the question is, does your organization currently capture, communicate, and report on project requirements? And the options are yes, no, I don't know. So again, we'll give everybody about 15 seconds to vote, and I'll go ahead and share the results afterwards. And again, as John mentioned earlier, don't hesitate to ask any questions at all. There's no such thing as a bad question, so we're available. I guess all this means, John, you're doing a heck of a job so far.
Good. I'm glad everyone, it's clear to everyone.
So we are going to close the poll, share the results. So again, the question was, does your organization currently capture, communicate, and report on project requirements? 75% said yes, which is actually very good. 8% said no, and then 17% said I don't know. So we'll go ahead and hide those. And John, you're back on.
Great, that's great. And at this point, I also like to turn the microphone over to Dan Dubé, who actually worked with us on creating test cases and test scripts and also executed test runs, and then captured any failures in defect tickets so that we could come around and fix those as necessary. I just want to clarify here that as part of the FDA validation process, we actually did our test runs in two segments. One was that sort of a dry run, and that's what we did with Fruition, working with the Dan Dubé. When it comes to the official testing, conforming to the FDA regulations, we actually conducted those in-house separately, but we were able to leverage what Dan had done before. So those were two separate steps of testing in our case, but when it comes to the first dry run, Dan's team conducted all that. So I'd like to just ask Dan to just give us how this worked out for you.
Yeah, you pretty much took all the words right out of my mouth, but yeah,
Sorry.
Definitely. As far as this is a good slide to have up here because basically, like as John was saying, Millennium came to us and wanting us to do the first dry run of their of testing their functional requirements before they actually got into the kind of meat and potatoes of the FDA testing. So yeah, so working with John, we he built the shaded areas in purple, which allowed us to take the requirements, that were already in Fruition's Requirement Center, and then write all the test cases and subsequent test scripts to those cases. And then once those were approved by Millennium, our testing services team went off and executed all those test scripts, subsequently logging defects into the green shaded area, which in essence turned around and were assigned to the Fruition and Millennium technical consultants that were on the implementation project who could quickly turn around those defects and allow us to go in and run through again and execute them again and make sure that they were fixed before Millennium moved on to the next phase in their validation process. So
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, John.
And with this kind of workflow and the process we defined between Millennium and Fruition, we were able to very rapidly execute these cycles. So there really was very little downtime for us in terms of communication or misunderstanding or anything falling through the cracks. And on our side, Cheryl Boudet was the project manager, and part of her daily routine was making sure that everything was being captured and processed and being updated and worked on. So at this point, I'd like to just turn over the microphone over to Cheryl, just to hear from her side of experience and how this entire process and the tools helped with her project management.
Modules there, and thank you, John. Having those modules there and the information clearly available to me as a project manager was extremely helpful. We had several engineers working to configure the various requirements. It was very easy to see who was assigned what task and what condition it was in. So every day I could go in and see what was going on and who had it. When it came to the testing, it was very, very helpful to having Fruition's help with this. They were able to draft the test cases and the test scripts and do the initial test run. When those test runs turn into defects, we were able to process those. Quite often, it turned out that the functional requirement that we had written ourselves was unclear. So we were able to update that and get that updated all the way through to the test scripts. So by the time we got to our internal official test run, we had very few variances, and it saved us a lot of time.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. When Cheryl is talking about variances, again, the FDA regulation dictates that we fully document any test of failures. And it actually takes a lot more documentation effort trying to document those failures than, in my opinion, fixing the defects sometimes. So again, not having had too many variances, with the results, with the help from Fruition's the initial dry runs or dry run testing, it was a great help for us, and that eventually saved us a lot of time as well. So I'm just gonna move on and then explain to you why we chose to do in certain ways for the detailed design specifications.
Hey, John.
So when it comes to detailed design specification, yes.
Hey, John, sorry to interrupt. We actually
Hello?
have a question from the audience, and it
yes.
ties back to that last slide we were on.
Yes.
So feel free to answer. Dan, jump in as well, because this might be more up your alley. But the question is, how do you differentiate between test cases, test scripts, and test runs?
Okay, I think I'll explain that to you, because these were actually something, again, we were subject to the way that our QA, the team that dictates how we define our processes and documentation. So those distinctions came from them. So let me just to give you a quick explanation on the differences. So whenever you have a functional requirements, for example, when you click on that button, it has to do certain activities around the screen. Those come down as what we call test cases. So test case would be representing, for example, if you have to approve a change, then test case would be around approving changes. And then from that particular test case, you would actually spin off multiple test scripts, meaning that if the test was for example, a major change, then you have the particular steps. You click here and there, pick this value, and then submit the change for approval. And this is what's expected results of that particular step or a set of steps for major changes. But if you have a minor change, for example, then you may also have a little bit different steps of processing the ticket and getting approval as well. So that may be test script number 2. Or you could have a multiple test scripts based on different combinations of those change attributes. So and all those different test scripts are just set of steps that you go through. Those may all fall under a particular test case, again called the change management approval process. So that's how they are differentiated. So when you have a test script written, that means you have steps you have documented, and a test run would be someone following those test steps and executing those test steps, and then documenting the results of the test run. So that would be the box, the module represented by test runs. Is it clear?
And hey, John,
Dan, do you have anything to add?
Just another good example of test cases and the corresponding scripts would be like on when you're making sure fields are mandatory on an incident form or something like that, where you'd have a positive and a negative test. So the overall test case would be the, having these fields as mandatory, and then the scripts would, one script would be, one child script under that test case would be around, filling all of the filling out all the mandatory fields and hitting submit and it working, and then like a negative test would be, around leaving each one of those fields blank and hitting submit and getting an error message kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Would be another good example of a test case in script.
Yes, a very good example there. Dan, given your experience with working with the multiple clients in various industries, would you say that like having test cases, test scripts, and test runs, would they be more of a typical of just about any industry, or was it something specific to our industry?
No, it's definitely not just with FDA and Millennium. It's everywhere. Every testing project that Fruition takes on goes through these same steps. So yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. And as I said in the beginning, I do think that all the Millennium, in our particular case, we did have to follow through more of FDA regulated practices. I think that overall, this is a good practice that anybody in any industry would be following. So I think there's a lot that we can share together, even if you do not work in the FDA regulated companies. So I'll move on to the next slide here. And again, I'm trying to explain to you why we went with the way that we capture detailed design. And the way that we defined detailed design was that, hey, if we had some kind of a functional requirement, detailed design is how that was implemented in ServiceNow, meaning that was how it was configured in ServiceNow. So plan A was that, as Chris was explaining, all of the configuration that you do in ServiceNow are captured in the update sets. So we said, okay, we'll just use the update sets. And the update sets, I don't know if everyone is familiar with the update sets in ServiceNow, but it basically captures like the configuration that you're making. So it captures like the values and whatnot, and which table or tables that they are stored in. So it does capture everything that you do, and in fact, you can save that update set and then apply that to another instance of your ServiceNow, and then that update set will be applied to that other instance, just like the way that you had manually configured in the original instance. So we said, okay, we're going to use that, and it's like XML document, very technically in nature, and has a lot of details. But we'll just use that, and then we'll just and then update set contains multiple what's called the customer updates, and the customer update is the individual update being made as you're going through the configuration steps. And we said we're going to just link that customer update to each functional requirement specification. But the update sets are not really for human consumption, and I don't know how many of you actually bother to open up some of those update sets and customer updates and look inside, and it's just a little mind-boggling. And then also there are very many customer updates are being produced as you are configuring your ServiceNow. So at the end we said, wow, there's just too many, and then it's really hard to track them manually and then try to tie them into the functional requirement specifications. So what we did was we moved on to plan B, where at the end of all the configurations, so we're not going to bother trying to pick out the update sets as we are configuring ServiceNow. So what we said was, all right, let's just wait until we're done with all the configurations and bug fixes and everything that we're trying to accomplish here. And then what we do is, before we release that, we just go against the sys tables. Again, I'm not sure if how many of you are familiar with the sys tables in ServiceNow, but sys tables in ServiceNow capture all your configurations. So basically, what's being captured through update sets, they are in fact being written to sys tables in ServiceNow. So we went against the sys tables, and then we just read all the configurations that matter to us, meaning that if it's an instant form, what are the fields that we're exposing there, and how do they tie into the underlying database table and the columns. So we wrote a pretty extensive set of SQL statements reading off those sys tables, And then we actually converted them into Word, excuse me, so more human-friendly format so that you can actually output the sys-table contents into Word documents, or in our case, the templates that we had to use as part of the QA process. So this final document would just capture a snapshot of, at any given time, of all the configurations that we had done. And then at the end, we were able to auto-generate about a 1,000-page document. So this is just a pictorial diagram of how we went about auto-documenting some things that we did. So once again, we captured all our requirements and all the subsequent steps in ServiceNow using Fruition's Requirement Center, as well as some additional modules that we built. And then we used the ODBC connection into ServiceNow to read off everything that we did in those ticket records, as well as in the systables. And then we used Microsoft Office automation to extract the data from ServiceNow through ODBC, and then format them in the way that we wanted, and then produce Word documents and Excel documents. And when I say script here in Office automation, it's mostly around like VBA, Visual Basic for Application, for Word and Excel. So I'm sure many of you have like run macros in Word or Excel, and then that's essentially what helped us produce those documents. So top 3 takeaways. So what we decided to do was we wanted to use ServiceNow for what it does best, and these are the things that ServiceNow does best in our opinion, and that is like tracking tickets, like the requirements, and collaboration. As Dan and Chris said, anything that we capture in there is visible to everyone. So across Fruition engineers and any other members of Fruition, anyone at Millennium, we could see everything that everyone else was doing. And everything was up to date, so you don't have any Excel spreadsheet that's sitting there being stale. And also relating tickets. So again, we used that related list feature within ServiceNow to tie all the tickets, all the requirements and specifications. So we were able to have the traceability built in automatically by design. And then we integrated with the Microsoft Office automation, in particular using the ODBC and scripting. And then in the end, we had increased efficiency and accuracy and transparency. So that is the end of my presentation here, and I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, John. Actually, lucky you, we do have a couple from the audience. And the first one is, so did Millennium follow a waterfall or agile or iterative type of development methodology?
So overall, our SDLC process is waterfall, but we had like a miniaturized iterative, or I should say miniaturized waterfall built into the in the overall waterfall model, meaning that. So what we did was we did not just had a requirements fixed in the beginning and then just worked off that. What we found out along the way was that the original requirements were not quite the way we wanted once we implemented it or once we tested it. So we had to go back and then revise the requirements along the way. And then that triggered iteration. And then we went through actually about 3-4 iterations before we said, okay, now this is good enough for release. So again, the overall, it's a waterfall in that in our the QA process, each document that we generate must be reviewed by our QA personnel, and then they actually have to sign off on those. So that kind of keeps our process rigid in that we do have to produce the user requirements specifications in the beginning. We have to get the approval, and then move on to the functional requirements, et cetera, et cetera. But along the way, if we do find something to be revised, then we are allowed to go back and then revise those documents we had submitted and got approval for. but that review process will now have to take place again for those additional changes that we introduced. So that's the process that we followed.
Nice. Thanks, John. Yeah, good question, good answer. And we actually have one more question here. So, do you see the potential to reuse the requirement center for other systems you need to validate that are not ServiceNow?
Yes, and the fact that question includes the word validation indicates that it's coming from somebody in the FDA regulated company. Yes, so we did have some discussions with our QA personnel here, and we did not have to validate the requirement center that we used based on the fact that we were using the resulting Word document as the basis of our GXP process. And when I say GXP, that's the FDA regulated process. GXP stands for like a good a practice, and XC means there's like a good clinical practice, good laboratory practice, etc. So overall, whenever we have an FDA regulated process, we just call that GXP. So that was the basis for our not having to validate that particular functionality of ServiceNow that we leveraged. Going forward, we'd like to eventually validate this tool. By the way, we did not migrate the requirement center in our the final production release of ServiceNow that we deployed. We actually stripped all that off because we did not want that to be part of our validated platform. But in the future, we'd like to actually have a requirement center like tool available to us in production environment that is validated so that we can capture requirements for any other systems that we may be deploying in the future.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
I think so, John. And I'll keep an eye on the question box here to see if there's any follow-ups. But I think that's a great answer. So thank you. And one last question here, and John, you could probably take a step back because I think this is more for Chris and Dan on the fruition side. The question is, and hopefully Chris and Dan, you're still out there, is it possible to use the requirement center if fruition did not do our initial implementation?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's just available to all service or all fruition customers. So whether you're in managed services, virtual admin, or doing some other project with us, it's available and loaded up for you. I don't think there's a decision has been made yet on making it available for the general ServiceNow customer base. I know we are working on our ServiceNow App Store, which will allow you to go out very soon and kind of download any of the fruition applications that we've built and released, packaged up and released that kind of tag onto the ServiceNow platform. And the requirement center will probably be part of that, but I don't know if there will be a cost or what that'll entail yet. So kind of stay tuned for that. I think marketing will probably be releasing more information about that as it gets closer to a decision made on what we're going to do with the requirements tracker for non-fruition customers.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, it looks like no more questions right now. So, John, if you could just move to the next slide, thanks. Yeah, and if you guys think of any questions at any time related to the Millennium story, it's okay to send us an email afterwards. Both my email address and John's email address are up here. So if you want to, again, learn more, talk more about Millennium's FDA validation process, if you have any questions about the requirement center, or even the virtual user group, send us an email, and we'll definitely get back to you. So, just a couple closing remarks. Just want to say thanks to John and Cheryl at Millennium for participating today. It's the whole Millennium story is just amazing. So, we're very happy to be in a relationship and partnership with them. So thanks to the two of you again, and thanks to everybody else who attended today for spending an hour with us. Lucky for you, actually get 30 minutes back in your day, so enjoy it. Couple quick notes. We're going to send out a follow-up blast probably, I'm thinking early next week, Monday or Tuesday before the holiday, with a PDF of today's deck along with a recording of the webinar. So if you missed anything today or want to revisit some of the material, you'll have both those resources available to you. And also stay tuned. We'll be sending out some more details on our next virtual user group scheduled for August 2013. So we hope to see all of you there for that. And I think that is it, everybody. So again, thank you for participating, and we look forward to talking to you all soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye.